All right, welcome everyone. We're here with Behind the Book with Dianne Dotson, and we'll be talking about her new book, The Inn at the Amethyst Lantern. Hi, Dianne. Thanks for coming.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's so great to be back. This is my hometown library in Kingsport, Tennessee. So great to be on here. And then my username, Jendia Gammon, that's my other pen name. So just to clear that up. So great to be back.
Yes, great to have you. So let's get started with what do you love about writing?
Well, I've been writing most of my life in one form or another as soon as I could hold a crayon, basically. And I feel that I just was always wanting to have adventures. So writing was a way for me to have them, within a small space and with no outside influence from a young age onward until I could be out in the world and be independent. So I kind of started to create worlds as a form of escape and fun, and I over time mastered language enough to get that where I needed it to be.
So you said you started at a very early age. So has your writing process changed over time?
It has. I've matured and, I learned a lot more of craft and things over the years and going through high school and then university and then writing for jobs occasionally on the side because I worked in science for a long time because I have a science degree. But I think that part of what hasn't changed is that when I'm immersed in it, I need to be fully distraction free, and then I can plow through a lot of words. And I am continuing to work that way where I can just sit down if there's no distractions and write thousands of words a day if I want to. The one way in which things have changed is that I've become more disciplined in how I use my time because I have very little of it to carve out for writing fiction versus doing day job writing for science writing and things like that, and also parenting and running a home and all these kinds of things. So it is, definitely a little of the same and a little bit more discipline and structure, but, still just able to sit down and immerse myself in another world.
All right. So speaking of other worlds, let's talk about The Inn at the Amethyst Lantern. What inspired you to write this story?
Here's the cover of the book. We can focus on that. There we go. Yay. This is the hardback. Comes in hardback and paperback. And so this came about because I started writing a lot of short stories, not just novels. I had the Questrison Saga, which I self-published, and I had the Shadow Galaxy, which was my traditional debut book, but it was a collection of short stories and poetry, science fiction, fantasy, and horror. But I had written a short story that I submitted to Solar Punk magazine because the call for it sounded so intriguing. Solar Punk is sort of a futuristic utopia based on solar energy and sustainability. And the aesthetic is like bright yellows and greens and oranges. And they wanted a lunar punk anthology. So then I'm like, well, what's lunar punk? And so it was the sort of the flip side where everything is night living, where you have purples and blues, you have phosphorescence and bioluminescence and, things like night creatures and people living a night life, and so they had the open call for the anthology. I wrote a story, submitted it, and they said, well, this is actually an adult anthology and you've written a young adult story and we've never had a young adult lunar punk story and we love the story, but it won't fit in the anthology. So would you like if we put it in the magazine? And I said, sure, so then to put it in the magazine. And while I was thinking about all this, I was flying back from England from visiting my husband, Gareth, now husband. And I came up with this entire universe based off of that story because I couldn't get it out of my head. And I was just fascinated by the concept of night living. And the short story was called Midnight Serenade. And it was in a way kind of a Cinderella story, but blending a little bit of science along with some fantasy because it's set in the future. And, in that story, Mira Celestis is the main character. And in the Amethyst Lantern, we learn about its main character, Jen Chin Lightworth, who is Mira's cousin. So Mira reappears again in the story. And that short story is now the prologue of the Amethyst Lantern. So you can read it in the book. first thing, so you get a sense for what's happening, because what Mira does in that short story, in that opening, is sort of create a Pandora's box situation that triggers the inn at the Amethyst Lantern. Is the inn behind the Amethyst Lantern, which is the lighthouse on the cover, and it looks like the Cape Hatteras light, except it's purple and white, and it has an amethyst bright light in it. So both the inn and the lantern are very ancient, dating back nobody knows how long, hundreds of years maybe. They don't know who built them in this future, which is about 500 years in the future. It's after a post-climate apocalyptic situation when people rebuilt and decided they needed to be living at night to avoid the sun's damage, and among other things, because in 500 years, it's never just one disaster. There have been wars, there have been other things that have happened, some of which the characters in the story don't really know about. It's just kind of, they've rebuilt a society based on night living, and it's got a bit of science and a bit of what we would call magic, and technology advanced enough to be magic, or is it real magic? I leave that up to people's imagination, but it's a brilliant world in which there's mystery and mayhem. And Jen discovers that there's maybe somebody still in the inn, and we don't know how old that person is, but she gets an invitation from 2 giant Luna moths, and it's an invitation for her to run the inn, and just out of the blue. She doesn't know what this is about, but her cousin set off a chain reaction in which leads to the reappearance of someone from the past that turns out to be a villain and in this future, and starts to break down their society, and monsters run amok and things like that. So Jen has to gather her cousin Mira, her brother Jazz, whatever teens they can grab, and try to fight this thing, sort of in a Stranger Things, Goonies kind of mashup of trying to just fight the end of the world.
So you talked about how, when you submitted that story, and it's like, well, we were using adult stories and this is young adult. So what's different about writing for a young adult audience?
Well, this is the first time I've written an adult novel. I've written short stories that are different age ranges, but for young adult novel, and it is considered age 13 to 18 for the audience, which it could be 13 to infinity, right? So anybody can read it, but probably need some guidance for anyone under 13. So this isn't the sort of young adult where it's basically adults cosplaying as teens. These are teens. The main character, Jen, is 14. Everybody else is 15, 16, 17 on down the line. And they're truly in their teens. They're dealing with all the dynamics of, coming of age and figuring out who they are and who they want to be. So that writing young adult was really fun for me because, for one thing, I have 2 teenagers, and I also remember my teens growing up in East Tennessee and all the adventures that my friends and I used to have, and some of the dynamics we had, and sort of mini groups and super groups, and just having a big time out there in the country back in the day.
So you talked about, I guess it was the Solar Punk magazine, and they were talking about doing lunar punk, and so I guess you did set out to create a lunar punk setting. So how does the world building evolve in lunar punk?
Well, in this case, I was kind of given a blank slate to come up with a lunar punk world, and the editor of Android Press, Justine, was open to the pitch. So how the book came about was that I had this world, and I came back to her and said, I've been obsessed with this world since I did this story with you in the magazine, and I think there's enough for a book here. And she said, well, gosh, write a book proposal and send it to us. And so I did, and she loved it. And then she started a book deal for it. So at the time, so I had the Shadow Galaxy book deal news and the Inn at the Amethyst Lantern book deal news on the same day, which was crazy day. My 2 debut traditional books, because before I was self-published author. And what came of that was that I had to dive deep into this lunar punk world and go back and forth a little bit with Justine and say, am I on the right track here? This is how I'm imagining this sort of science mixed with fantasy future. And she was very excited by what I came up with. So then I went whole hog nuts. All kinds of glowing things, sustainable environment, sustainable homes in which, robots serve as ovens, and then they go plug their legs into the ground at night and heat up the underground caverns that every house has for growing fungi and other garden foods and things like that. You have a whole system of tunnels that, you don't have to be out during the day, that you can go through, and there's malls and then tunnels and things like this. And then you have the lighthouse itself, which is a relic of our era and the sort of sloping into night living. There's an era that was called the golden hour, in which people realized it was becoming too dangerous and not sustainable to live above ground, that a lot of ecosystems were collapsing. So they decided to basically have a big party, and the inn used to be this place of parties. It used to be the center of society. And then everything just kind of got turned upside down, and sometimes literally, and then fading out and dealing with all the crises around the world, and then their isolation where they're at, so that you create this contained system where people figure it out and they're used to it. It's a utopia when the book starts, and they seem relatively safe and happy until things go haywire because someone from our time disrupts their nice future. So it was really fun to kind of just dive into that mix of, let's have moonlight and purple stuff and mushrooms and night animals, all kinds of animals actually, and sentient ones. And I just had fun with it. I just created this whole universe in the town of Glimmerbite, which is a bight, B-I-G-H-T, is like a large bay, kind of like the California Bight, from Point Conception all the way down, to the border of Mexico. So large base, you have this crescent beach, town of Glimmerbite, and it's lunar punk society where they celebrate, their day is nighttime. And when dawn starts to come, they hightail it inside and they sleep all day. So, but don't call them vampires. They don't like that.
Yeah. So what themes does a lunar punk setting allow you to explore?
Well, night living, as mentioned before, also coming up with ways to use night as a different form of society to cope with climate change or any other societal changes from disasters over the centuries. And I think that the best part about it too is that you're tapping into old knowledge and new science in a way that's sort of blending magic into it and sort of a spirituality. Some people adhere more to the science side, some people more to the spiritual side. Some people like Nyota are kind of in the middle, both astronomer and astrologer, and so it's a neat mix of lunar being, moon, punk being kind of against, the society a little bit, so that I'll play more with the punk in the future, but there's sort of going against, like rebelling, against the older generation, and these kids realizing that the older people aren't doing what it's going to take to save them, so they have to do it themselves. So it's a little bit of the punk vibe there, not quite anarchist, but at the same time, very rebellious. So.
Yeah. So you have a background in science writing. How did that inform your writing for this book?
Well, my degree is in ecology and evolutionary biology, and I had worked in bench science and then research both in ecology and clinical research in public health for years before I became a science writer, which I became a science writer about the time I started having children so I could work from home. And science writing allowed me to do a lot of research and sort of distill scientific knowledge into, taking tons of research papers and just distilling that into different nuggets of articles from different sizes. It was fun to do that. I did a lot of research, which honed my research skills, so that when I was researching certain species in these books, to try to project how would they adapt, over time, what would it look like? How would plants adapt? How would animals adapt? And throw some fantastical elements in too, like the biolumin pen, which is this like husk of a newspaper. It just sort of blooms and then it vanishes. And there's a little bit of an annoying aspect to that, of this gossip rag that everybody gets their news from. It comes unfurled, you read it and it's just poof, gone. And raccoons and possums come around and foxes to collect them in baskets and recycle them. It's a whole, wacky sort of futuristic, sort of Studio Ghibli slant to it, where everything's a little bit off kilter. We still recognize a lot of it, but there's something definitely different about this future.
It's funny that you mentioned that Studio Ghibli because, when I read your Questrison Saga, I was, from a cinematic brain standpoint, imagining in my head, I was thinking like, okay, MCU, big blockbuster movie thing going on in space.
Right.
But like really the aesthetic I was getting in my head was an anime for this one.
Oh yeah,
definitely. Absolutely. With the color scheme and just like with the teenagers and their interactions and just everything that was going on. I definitely was like, this needs to be an anime.
Well, and I loved anime. So that actually informed the Questrison Saga a lot because especially Macross Plus, there's definitely a lot of influence among many other influences the Questrison Saga pulled from Macross Plus. But I also used to watch Vision of Escaflowne, and that kind of influenced both the Questrison Saga and the Inn at the Amethyst Lantern. Plus, I fell whole hog in love with Studio Ghibli, like Miyazaki films, My Neighbor Totoro, and then Kiki's Delivery Service. Love that movie. And just this sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge of this magic being right on the cusp of like right out of our corner of our eye. A little bit Wonderland and Oz to it as well.
So when you were writing this, did the story take any unexpected turns?
Well, I knew usually when I'm writing a book, I kind of see it all kind of as a movie in my head, and I just have to get it down on paper, and it's a matter of finding the time to do that. So I know the beginning and the big set pieces and the end. It's like a movie in my head. But one of the ways that I adapted, as I was going along, I was sticking to the plot because I had already framed it out in the proposal and knew what I wanted to do, was that I liked the idea of doing some twists and turns that people weren't expecting that helped character and plot development. And I think those are ways that you can go back and tweak and cut the story, like action cut, like a movie. You would end the chapter on a cliffhanger. And that was something that I decided that made a much more fun approach to some of the reveals, was to kind of, wait a minute, this needs to be a cliffhanger into the chapter, and people will be like, what? And then they'll want to keep reading, So that was one of the things that evolved as I was writing, was where to structure those breaks and those cut scenes, So.
What did you learn while writing this story?
I learned that I can write a novel in 2 months, which I did. And I knew I could write fast because I'm a fast writer. I'm a journalist. I still have the fire of deadlines under me from science writing, in which you have to get a lot of words out in, 2 days or 3 at most, etc. And I just I learned that I could sit down and get a lot done in a short period of time. And that made me more confident in approaching. As soon as I got my agent offer and we started working on what we would be sending out, I realized how quickly I could write these books, and that potentially I could build a traditional publishing career very fast. And because I had kind of dallied with the self-publishing because it's expensive. If it had been cheaper to make a high quality book that you pay editors to do and pay for cover art, then maybe I would have written them faster and made more of them. But, that saga, though, was contained in 4 books. And I felt like I was kind of done with all that work, and I wanted somebody else to just publish it. I was like, I'd rather just write, I just want to write the story. So I feel like definitely learned what I was capable of doing. I also learned that in working in traditional publishing, there's some aspects that you need to step back from a little bit. And that was a learning curve, going from self-publishing to traditional, realizing that certain things were out of your hands. Certain things are still in your control, though, and you have opinions. I was able to pick out the cover artist. I knew this gal. I had commissioned her for a Questrison Saga character, Galadea, and I loved her work. And when I thought about this story, I thought her work is so perfect for this. because I remembered one of her artworks. It's sort of painting this glowing night scene. I thought she will nail it, and if I can get her, perfect. And she did, and that's Kim Herbst. And I got to meet her a couple of weeks ago in San Francisco, finally in person. You can see the cover, but she did just a beautiful job. So I learned too that marketing, is different for different sizes of publishers, and this is a small press, Android press, relatively new, publishing really exciting, diverse, and pushing the boundaries in ways that the big five just doesn't do, right? And I get excited by that. So now I'm really excited by small press, supporting them and working with them and forming my own. I decided to form my own small press. So that will be another project I take on in the new year. And I also learned that when you're working with a publishing company, that it's a bit like a family, that you have publishing siblings, like you see other authors slowly rolling out, with their books under the same envelope or umbrella. And I love that. And so I've been trying to kind of cross promote my publishing siblings, at Android Press, because so much really great stuff being published. And I think that's such a cool part of being part of traditional publishing that I would never have experienced, in self-publishing. So really neat to be able to, I truly believe in writers supporting writers.
I think in any profession or even just any artistic pursuit, it's nice to find your people.
Yeah,
exactly. So what do you want your readers to take away from this story?
Well, it's an adventure, first of all, but there's also a huge aspect of both friendship and leadership and growing into the role of being a leader. Gentian Lightworth had no desire to be a leader. She just wanted, go on some adventures, read some books, be a nerd, essentially. And she has to step up and try to help rally people around her and try to save the world. Like, how do you go from just hanging out with your parents and kind of getting along and not along with your brother, and then jumping into that? So I wanted people to take away from that you can become a leader no matter what the circumstances are, and that you can build a new community from the ashes of something old.
Yeah, I was going to say also, I guess something that anyone listening or watching this could learn from is, if you're out there doing your NaNoWriMo, it can be done, because as you said, you can get the book written quickly.
Yeah. That's not for everyone though. Like I said, my science writing journalism deadlines kind of made me used to writing fast. And I noticed that other writers who write really fast oftentimes have a journalism background. It's kind of interesting. Like, oh, that's why, because Gareth doesn't write as fast and his books are excellent. So it doesn't mean, you still need the time to let your story breathe, and you need to go through your edits, and you need to hand it off, and that editor needs to take it. So it's a process, and it isn't for everyone to write that quickly. It can be done. I'm not sure if it should be for everybody though.
Yeah, I guess that's the thing. The process is unique for everyone.
It is.
Yeah.
There is no wrong way to do it.
Yeah. Do you think you could do a little reading from the book for us?
Oh, okay. Let's see. I don't know where I should start. So let me see. Here we go. Luminous. Under the filtered moonlight of high summer clouds, the troop climbed the steep pathway to the forest ridge, looking out at the inn. There was much protesting and occasional swearing. Anisette slipped, hitting her brother Fan, who stumbled backward and knocked heads with Jazz, who brought up the rear. Jen heard snatches of barbed talk and a few choice epithets, and she wanted to turn and tell them all to stop. But if she turned, she might strike Mira, who pushed just behind her, or Lynn, and then start a domino effect down the narrow path. So she ground her teeth and moved forward. She reached the top and looked out. Moonlight edged the billowing little altocumulus clouds with silver, contrasting their pewter centers. The diffused glow cast strange, muted shadows from tall trees. Jen felt the familiar sea breeze in her hair, spiking around her face, and she took off her cap to let it wash over her, carrying in moisture and nutrients from far out at sea. It was this wind and the moisture within it that helped the trees grow so tall, particularly on the hills and in the forest to the east, despite the punishing sun of daylight. This was the source of the evening's dew all along the promontory, from which the Amethyst Lantern shot upward, a lone sentinel in the dark, up where only bats, owls, and moths travailed the starlit skies. The stars were muted by the watercolor wash of creamy moonlight overtaking the night. Jen could have gazed forever at the scene of the lantern's slow-wheeling light, the softly dappled dark sea on the horizon, and the pale inn below. Something nudged her elbow. She turned and found Lynn and Nyota next to her, and she felt a startled jolt back into the present. She chewed on her lower lip. Just beyond those trees, Jen led the group on a path around the trees above the inn. Their boughs creaked in the evening wind, and far off, she could hear a buoy clanging. But other than that, this side of the shore was abandoned, completely unlike the ancient days that Bendon showed her. They followed her, and she stopped just above the end. It lay in silence, but for crickets in the shadows. The filtered moonlight made its angles look softer, more weathered, and somehow to Jen, forlorn. She turned to face the team. "Hi," Jen said so loudly that an owl catapulted from a nearby tree and brushed the top of her head in its indignant flight. Her cap twirled off into the dew-rich grass. She knelt to pick it up, grunted at the effort, and then blushed. For again, she forgot one most unusual thing. Everyone was staring at her. Everyone. She tried unsuccessfully to look anywhere else, to the sky, to the roving hedgehog couple that she spied trundling along next to them all, to the watch on her wrist. Still, she couldn't look away from them now. Some deep instinct guided Jen, and she felt it best to see how that went. Still, she didn't like speaking in front of a crowd. Mira could tell, and stood with her cousin, giving her a little nudge. Jen began. She blew air out of her mouth, and it fluffed her choppy, dark blue bangs upward. "I know this sounds crazy," she went on, "but I think something's happened to Bendon, the innkeeper. But I don't really know what to expect. The inn was full of purple light from some source beneath it, and I don't know what else is in there or where he might be. All I know is he said something happened and he wanted us here, but the inn isn't small and I don't know where to start. I think we could each look for different things in small groups. You've all got lights." Murmurs and nods of agreement met her ears. "Then let's go find Bendon," Jen said. She privately hoped a hole would open beneath her and pop her right out the cliffside, where one of the ancient balloons from the inn's party days might show up and lift her away. She felt nauseous and sweaty, and she absently took one of her beverage globes off her necklace and put it in her mouth to dissolve. At this rate, I'm going to need a pee soon, Jen thought, and she wondered what the toilets were like in the inn. Then she wondered if there even were any toilets after all this time. That stopped her for a second, and while she let the group down to the inn's back door, where she entered the first time, her thoughts wheeled over Bendon. How he had been able to function there. She'd never seen him out and about and suspected, based on the mystery surrounding him in the inn, that he probably never did get out and had things like food delivered. Her father, Harris, had spoken about the letters that the old gentleman had sent forth decades prior. Was that something Bendon always did? For how long? And how old was he anyway? Jen found herself staring at the door, having fallen so deep in thought that she completely forgot anyone stood behind her. Jazz cleared his throat. Jen swallowed and turned to see him and the others. "Okay," she said. Jazz, Mira, each of you take a couple of folks. We can split up inside." Mira chose Fan and Amber. Jazz chose Anisette and Datura. Jen faced Lynn and Nyota, both of whom had joined her before anyone else could. Jen's face tingled. She would have been happy with any of them, but she was especially pleased with these two. She faced the spot where the door had been, and dark purple handles appeared. She reached out, slowly resting a hand on those handles. She paused briefly and took a deep breath. She pulled them. The strangely blank darkness within the inn disturbed Jen, much as it had the first time, but she lit her headlamp. Lynn followed suit, and Nyota held her staff out. Its tip shone forth, the light slicing through dust motes. The others entered behind her. Jen looked back and saw the doors to the bar stood ajar. Could someone shut that? She called out. Her voice echoed faintly in the dark space of the hotel, and she shivered. Why? Finn asked. Because, Jen said, and then she stopped. I know, she thought. Seems proper. But what if we need to run out? She hesitated. Well, I don't want anyone sneaking in behind us, she finally said. If Bendon is in trouble, maybe we better think like that. In fact, maybe we should lock it? Nope, Chaz said, emphatic. I vote we keep it unlocked in case we have to run out of here. I don't want anything in my way. This place is old. The lock could break or something. I don't know. Murmurs of assent met Jen's ears, and she blushed. Not that anyone could really see that she did among their bobbing headlights, staff, or in Amber's case, a wrist lantern. Maybe Jazz should be in charge. Maybe anyone else. She felt frustrated. Okay, we leave it unlocked. But for the light, I know there's a big purple light in here somewhere, but I'm not sure where. The center of the floor? Maybe it shows up? But until then, let's see if we can find another light source. I don't know what, if any, kind of power there is here. It's not like any other place I've ever seen. You could say that again, Anisette murmured dryly as she drew her hands across a long shuttered windowsill, revealing thick dust. She wiped her hands together to get the dust off, and it scattered in the light of her headlamp. Datura sneezed. Even her sneeze is pretty, Jen thought, mildly irritated. Split up, she told the fireflies. Look for Bendon, and let's meet back here in, let's say, an hour. And so they went off in their groups, and Lynn and Nyota joined Jen on either side of her. Nyota's staff glowed upon the walls as she walked along. Their footfalls echoed throughout the inn. And Jen would have given much to have been able to see it fully lit, for its ceilings were high, and truly it must have been splendid so long ago. Nyota halted her steps then. Look at this. The tall girl raised her staff. The bangles on her forearms and wrists clinked together as she did so. She shone the light on a painting, as high as she could lift her staff, and it was an enormous piece of art, stretching perhaps 20 feet up, Jen guessed. The art looked at first like an oil painting, but something in the surface, upon contact with light, set it flowing and reflecting Nyota's light. Jen aimed her own light up at the work, and it moved more quickly, shifting scenes. It's responding to light, said Lynn, sweeping his own lamplight across it. And it's changing the scene as it does. Nyota's dark eyes darted across the piece. Is this the end? Yes, Jen said, recognizing some of the exterior, the gardens, the many tumbling vines and flowers and fountains. The colors swim about. The scene shifted, and in some ways a slower, silent version of the images Bendon had showed her, Mira, and Jazz. It was gorgeous, Nyota breathed. Wow. And now look at it. Lynn said softly, nothing lasts, as Jen turned to him and squinted. I'll stop there.
Yeah, so good. I'm not going to give any spoilers. I've read it myself, but I got to say, you talked about cliffhanger ending of chapters. I got to the end. It's like, okay, please tell me there's a sequel or something in the works.
Fingers and toes crossed. We'll see. I'm hoping so.
Yeah.
That's all I can say.
Yeah, because there was definitely things I was like, oh, I see the setup. I see the setup for more coming. Definitely.
Yep. Yep.
So speaking of, what are your current next projects you're working on?
Well, this has been a busy year. As soon as I got the agent last year, I started working on an epic fantasy involving dragons and a princess who would rather be a knight or a sorceress witch like her mother who abdicated the throne. And so that was put on submission in January, and we had incredible feedback. People loved it, but the age of the content, there wasn't a demand for young adult, and we thought it was maybe new adult crossover. So that kind of put in frame for us that right now, young adult is a little challenging depending on the content. So it was pulled off submission. And then while it was on submission, I was writing a thriller with sci-fi and horror elements, something kind of along the lines of Annihilation a little bit, or something spooky like an X-Files kind of situation. And that has just gone on submission. And what that means is editors at big publishing houses, like the Big Five and independent houses, have the book and their editors are reading through, and we wait and we wait and we wait some more to see if any of them wants to publish the book, right? So it's a long waiting game, and that will be on submission for, probably another 4 months or so, 5 months. While that's happening, I've been writing a campy horror story that's got some really savage wit, and I'm having a lot of fun with that. I'd like to get that to my agent by December, and after that, in the new year, I'm going to be going back to space and writing a new space opera, but you may see some familiar faces, particularly if you've read The Shadow Galaxy and Opal World Frolic in my Rhapsody of the Spheres. You can't see it back there, but I have several short stories that are set in space. And there's some commonalities that some of them have sentient ships, some of them have cyborgs, some of them have veterans, and all of them are a little bit space pirate, you know, and might bring the band back together and have some space pirate action in the new year, but with some added spice. And so that's going to be a fun new angle. So we'll see. And after that, I don't know. I might go back to fantasy. I'd like to do more horror. I'm going between the three main genres and exploring different subgenres within them and having a lot of fun.
You can never go wrong with space piracy.
I agree.
Yeah, very fun. So does anybody, I'll open up the floor to questions. Does anybody have any questions for Dianne?
Hi. Yeah, I was just wondering that it's such a well-realized world in this book, and obviously I was privileged to read it as it was being written, but it's such a well-realized world, and there's such a big potential setting out there. I mean, do you have a lot of plans for sequels?
Well, I know what I would like to tell if there were sequels. You know, there is so much in that world, but there's also room for prequels, because that 500-year span, a lot happened in that time period. You know, the whole story of the Golden Hour and how that society kind of wound down. You know, you could have stories there. You could have it sort of in the middle when people were trying to figure things out. You could go in so many directions here, and not just with, you know, some familiar characters, but also some new ones. And I pretty much know what I want to do if I'm given license to do it. So yeah, there's room for a lot of stories in this universe. And, you know, the question of what's beyond, you know, these kids' world, you know, that's a big question as well. What's out there?
That's definitely what I was thinking after getting to the end. I was like, okay, there's a lot more here. Yeah, I was also wondering, was that Nyota, was that a Uhura reference?
It's in honor of Nichelle Nichols.
Yeah.
Uhura from Star Trek.
Nice little Easter egg.
Yep. That's my little honor to her. So yeah, so it's a fun universe, and anybody from 13 to infinity, I think you'll enjoy it. You can get it from anywhere online. A few places out there have some signed copies, and you can also order directly from the publisher in paperback, hardback, or ebook. There are eventual plans for audio, but that's not ready yet, so I don't know when that's coming, but there are plans, which is great because I have never had an audiobook before, so that'll be loads of fun.
What's that audiobook process like?
Well, in this case, they have someone, the publisher has someone, a contract to do the reading, you know. So I had to go through the book and pronounce every single thing that was remotely not a normal word, which in my worlds, I invent a lot of words, a lot of names. And so I went through and recorded how each one should sound, so that the voice actor can go through and incorporate that when they read the book, which is pretty neat. So, and then they have their sound booth and they go through the process. And Gareth has recorded an audiobook of his nonfiction book about writing. So, you know, he's a good person to ask for how that process works.
It was an experience. It was.
You're not a voice actor. You're not a voice actor, right? You know, like you're just reading your book.
Yeah, I've never done it before. And to be honest, spending 2 days reading just out loud is when you're used to just being at home, not talking, typing, is really brutal on your throat. But it was fun. I was in a very small booth, very hot booth, drinking endless cups of tea to keep my throat lubricated. But it was really good. I would really, I would do it again in a heartbeat. But you have to have a good producer there who can, like, every time you mess up, they just skip the tape back 10 seconds and you redo the line. So that was good. And because of her, I got through it quite quickly, because we didn't have to spend ages like redoing bits, and she would just go boom, back again, do that a bit again. And that was brilliant. But yeah, I had to drink a lot of ice water that first evening, just to get the vocal cords back to, like a runner has to get into a bath of ice. It was the same with the vocal cords. It was brutal.
It makes you definitely appreciate what voice actors do. And then I'm so excited to hear how they'll act, right? Like what the voices will be like, and or will there be effects, or how will the story sound versus the actual narration. I can't wait to hear it. So very excited.
I am too. I'm a big fan of the audio format. I'm able to multitask a lot by, popping in an earbud. I've got my book going. I'm, embroidering or folding laundry or whatever it is. Yeah. And, sometimes, you can get a voice actor that's so good as a narrator that, like, I'm going to go listen to a book that they narrated from an author I would have never picked up. Right. Because I'm like, oh, I want to hear how they do it. Cause, like, they're just so, some people are just so good at it.
Charismatic. Yeah. I know some people like that. Yeah. It's a great skill, and we still need people to do it.
Yes, definitely people. Hey, I'm all for sci-fi and technology, but yes, we want people doing these things.
Yes.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you for coming. I had so much fun reading the book. It was great.
Great.
I mean, just the colors and stuff, like the whole aesthetic. I love purple and green and stuff, and so that's for fun and everything. But yeah, it was great to talk to you again, and I'm looking forward to the next book.
All right. Well, let's hope there is one, and I will. If there is, everybody will know as soon as I know, or more or less. Right.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thanks.
Thank you. It's been great to be back.